How England was formed was a journey through many years of wars, hardship, and labor. It was a process that involved negotiation, assimilation, and bringing together small kingdoms to form what we all know as England today. In the spring of AD 43, the English Channel became the threshold of an empire. From the coasts of Gaul, a Roman invasion force assembled under the command of Aulus Claudius, a seasoned general appointed by Emperor Claudius. Rome had long coveted the mist-shrouded island across the narrow sea. Julius Caesar had ventured there a century earlier, in 55 and 54 BC, but his incursions were brief, more gestures of dominance than conquest. Now Claudius, eager to secure his legitimacy as emperor, sought to finish what Caesar had begun, to bring Britannia into the fold of Rome. For legions, totaling around 40,000 men, embarked on this enterprise. They were the Legio II Augusta, Legio IX Hispana, Legio XIV Gemina, and Legio XX Valeria Victrix, supported by cavalry and auxiliaries drawn from across the empire. Their armaments gleamed with the order of imperial discipline, rectangular shields, gladii at their sides, and standards bearing the eagles of Rome. They crossed the Channel and landed on the shores of Kent, near the territory of the Cativalani, a powerful tribe that had dominated southeastern Britain before Rome's arrival. The initial resistance was fierce. The Cativalani, led by Caratacus and Tagadumnus, rallied neighboring tribes against the invaders. The Britons fought from dense forests and marshes, ambushing the legions in terrain unfamiliar to Roman tactics. Yet Rome's discipline prevailed. The legions advanced methodically inland, establishing fortified camps and securing supply lines. After early clashes along the Thames, Tagadumnus was killed, and Caratacus withdrew westward. By AD 47, the Romans had established firm control over the southeast. They founded Camulodunum, modern Colchester, as the first Roman capital of Britain, a colony for retired soldiers and a symbol of imperial permanence. Not long after, they founded Londinium, a settlement on the River Thames that quickly grew into a bustling port and administrative hub. Roads radiated from these centers, following the Roman formula of conquest through infrastructure. The Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Fosse Way connected forts, garrisons, and provincial towns, transforming the landscape into a network of Roman order. Britain was declared a Roman province, governed by imperial legates appointed from Rome. Taxes were levied, censuses taken, and local elites were courted with Roman citizenship and privilege. The transformation was swift and deliberate. Roman law, Latin language, and monumental architecture began reshaping Celtic society. Villas appeared in the countryside, decorated with mosaics and bathhouses. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and the emperor rose beside native shrines. Yet beneath this order simmered resentment. The imposition of Roman taxation, land seizures, and the arrogance of imperial officials stirred native discontent. Nowhere would that anger burn more fiercely than in the lands of the Iceni, a tribe in eastern Britain. Their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a client ally of Rome, permitted to retain local autonomy in exchange for loyalty. But when Prasutagus died around AD 60, he left a will dividing his wealth between his daughters and the emperor, a gesture meant to preserve peace. Instead, Roman officials seized the kingdom outright. The Iceni were stripped of property. Prasutagus's widow, Boudica, was publicly flogged, and her daughters were assaulted. The outrage ignited rebellion. Boudica became the figurehead of vengeance. Joining forces with neighboring tribes, she assembled an army that surged across the Romanized southeast. Camulodunum fell first, its Roman colonists slaughtered, and its temple to Claudius set aflame. The rebels then marched on Londinium, which Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was forced to abandon to gather his forces. Boudica's army razed the city, killing tens of thousands. Archaeologists have found a thick layer of charred debris, the Boudiccan destruction layer, still marking the event beneath modern London. The rebellion spread rapidly, consuming Verulamium, modern St. Albans, as well. But Suetonius, disciplined and patient, regrouped his legions somewhere in the Midlands. In a decisive engagement, the Battle of Watling Street, the Romans, though vastly outnumbered, used superior tactics and discipline to annihilate the Britons. Ancient accounts record up to 80,000 Britons slain against only 400 Roman casualties. Boudicca's fate is uncertain. Some say she took poison rather than be captured. Her revolt failed militarily, yet it seared her name into history, a symbol of native resistance and the cost of empire. In the aftermath, Rome tightened its grip. The province was reorganized, and London was rebuilt on a grander scale. But the lesson was clear. Romanization would proceed not merely through force, but through administration, economy, and culture. Over the following decades, Roman influence spread deeper into the island. From AD 70 to 85, successive governors undertook the gradual conquest of Wales and northern Britain. One of the most significant was Gnaeus Julius Agricola, appointed governor in AD 78. Agricola's campaigns were methodical and far-reaching. He subdued the tribes of Wales, including the Ordovices, and established forts stretching toward the north. His forces advanced through the highlands of modern Scotland, constructing roads and fortifications that still trace their lines across the landscape. Agricola's final campaign, around AD 83 to 84, reached the far north. Roman forces engaged the Caledonian tribes under the chieftain Calgacus at the Battle of Mons Graupius, possibly near modern Aberdeenshire. According to the historian Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, the Romans claimed victory, killing thousands while suffering minimal losses. Tacitus attributes to Calgacus a defiant speech before the battle. They make a desert and call it peace. Whether genuine or imagined, the words capture the tension of empire and resistance at the edge of the known world. Despite Agricola's successes, Rome's expansion halted short of full conquest. The northern highlands remained unconquered, their rugged terrain and defiant tribes too costly to subdue. Instead, the Romans consolidated control south of this frontier. Forts were established at Eboracum, York, Deva, Chester, and Caerleon, forming strategic centers for the legions. The empire imposed its order through urbanization and assimilation rather than endless war. By AD 85, Britannia was a province fully integrated into the Roman world, at least from the Thames to the Forth. Latin inscriptions appeared on tombs and altars. Roman baths and amphitheaters rose amid once tribal landscapes. Provincial governors ruled in the emperor's name, and Roman merchants trafficked in goods from Spain, Gaul, and Africa. The island, once a periphery of myth, was now an outpost of civilization's most enduring empire. But the cost of that transformation was immense. Celtic identity had been fractured, native elites co-opted or eliminated, and the island's wealth redirected toward Rome's distant coffers. Yet the Roman presence also brought new forms of order, written administration, architectural permanence, and the foundations of roads and cities that would outlast the empire itself. The people of Britain lived now in the rhythm of Rome. Legionaries patrolled the frontiers, traders filled the markets, and provincial officials drafted decrees in Latin. A child born in Londinium in AD 85 would have grown up believing Rome eternal, its reach limitless, its peace unbreakable. Few could imagine that this order, so new, so total, would one day collapse into silence. For now, the eagle banners of Rome flew across Britain, gleaming in the northern sun. The island was no longer the world beyond the edge. It was part of the empire's vast machinery, pulsing with its laws, roads, and faith in permanence. But empires are never still. Beyond the walls of the Roman forts, The tribes of the north watched and waited. Change was already stirring in distant provinces. And as the first century neared its end, the peace Rome had built upon conquest would begin to strain. When the first century drew to its close, Roman Britain appeared, on the surface, as another province securely bound to the vast machinery of imperial power. The legions had subdued the southern tribes, forts lined the frontiers, and Roman roads stitched together a land that once knew only tribal boundaries. Yet beneath the ordered calm of villas and marketplaces lay a persistent unease. By the early 2nd century, the empire under Emperor Hadrian sought to define and defend, rather than endlessly expand. Around AD 122, construction began on Hadrian's Wall, stretching roughly 73 miles from the Tyne to the Solway Firth. It was both a barrier and a symbol, a declaration that this was Rome's edge. Garrisoned by thousands of soldiers, the wall marked the boundary between the Romanized south and the unconquered north. Behind its stones, towns like Eboracum, York, and Londinium flourished, showcasing temples, baths, and amphitheaters. But to the north, beyond the reach of Latin and law, the Picts remained untamed. When Emperor Antoninus Pius succeeded Hadrian in AD 138, he briefly pushed the frontier northward again, constructing the Antonine Wall around AD 142 between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. It was an ambitious gesture, but unsustainable. By the 160s, the Romans had withdrawn once more to Hadrian's line. The pattern of advance and retreat defined the imperial strategy in Britain, a rhythm of control and concession, conquest and containment. Yet the challenge to Roman rule did not only come from beyond the wall. Within the province, resentment simmered among the Britons who bore the weight of taxation, land seizures, and the slow erosion of their native traditions. Archaeological traces tell of hybridization, local gods renamed in Latin, tribal elites adopting Roman manners while quietly maintaining Celtic customs. Beneath this cultural negotiation lay the potential for revolt. By the 3rd century, Rome's vast empire was beginning to fracture under internal strain. Civil wars, economic decline, and barbarian incursions on the continent stretched imperial authority thin. Britain, remote and valuable, became both a resource and a refuge for ambitious generals. In AD 196, Claudius Albinus, governor of Britain, declared himself emperor and marched to Gaul, leaving the island vulnerable. His defeat by Septimius Severus only deepened imperial suspicion of Britain's loyalty. Severus himself arrived in AD 208, determined to subdue the north once and for all. His campaigns against the Caledonians were harsh and costly. By AD 211, he was dead in York. His body returned to Rome, but his ambitions were buried in British soil. After Severus, the empire's grasp on Britain weakened steadily. In AD 260, the so-called Gallic Empire, a breakaway state under Postumus, briefly included Britain. Though reabsorbed into the empire, the incident revealed the province's growing isolation. Trade with the continent declined. Roman garrisons were reduced. By the late 3rd century, external threats multiplied. Irish raiders struck the western coasts. Pictish war bands crossed Hadrian's Wall, and Saxon pirates harassed the southeastern shores. In response, the Romans constructed the Saxon shore forts, a chain of heavily fortified bases such as Portus Lamanis, Lim, Dubris, Dover, and Brancaster, designed to repel maritime incursions. Yet even these fortifications could not halt the slow erosion of imperial authority. In AD 286, the Admiral Carausius, tasked with defending the coast, declared himself Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul. His reign lasted nearly a decade, a remarkable episode of semi-independent rule that reflected both the strength and fragility of Roman Britain. When he was finally overthrown in AD 293, imperial unity was briefly restored, but the precedent of British autonomy had been set. By the 4th century, Roman Britain was increasingly detached from the empire's political core. Christianity began to spread, first quietly, then with imperial sanction after Constantine's conversion in AD 312. Villas and towns show signs of this transition. Pagan shrines replaced by small chapels, mosaics adorned with Christian symbols. Yet the outer provinces were growing restless. In AD 367, a massive coordinated assault known as the Great Conspiracy struck the island. Picts, Scots, and Saxons attacked simultaneously, aided by rebellion within Roman garrisons. It took the general Theodosius, father of the future emperor, to restore order in AD 369. His reforms stabilized the province temporarily, but the cracks in the system had become irreversible. The late 4th century was marked by uncertainty. Imperial authority was still represented by governors and legions, but their control was more administrative than real. The Western Empire was crumbling under barbarian pressure. When Alaric's Goths sacked Rome in AD 410, it symbolized the end of an age, but Britain had already been abandoned. Around AD 407, the Roman commander Constantine III withdrew the legions to support his claim to the imperial throne in Gaul. They never returned. The Emperor Honorius, in AD 410, reportedly sent a letter advising the cities of Britain to look to their own defense. And so, after nearly 4 centuries of Roman occupation, Britain was left adrift, its roads, forts, and towns standing as monuments to a vanished power. The transition was not abrupt. The Roman way of life lingered in local institutions, in the Latin tongue of the clergy, and in the faint structure of governance. But the military backbone was gone, and with it the shield that had guarded the island from external invasion. In the decades that followed, the infrastructure of Roman Britain decayed. Towns were abandoned or depopulated. Trade networks collapsed. The villas, once symbols of prosperity, fell silent. Archaeological layers reveal burn marks and neglect, traces of societal regression. Yet out of this twilight would emerge new leaders and new alliances. The Romano-British elite, now cut off from imperial protection, turned inward, forming local kingdoms and fortresses to defend their lands. This was the dawn of a new and chaotic age. Without Rome, Britain fragmented into a patchwork of petty realms, each clinging to remnants of order in a world slipping toward anarchy. Into this vacuum, new peoples began to arrive across the North Sea. They came not as allies or traders, but as settlers and conquerors. As the 5th century unfolded, the withdrawal of Rome set the stage for the rise of the Anglo-Saxons, a movement that would reshape the language, culture, and very identity of the land. The island that once called itself a province of Rome was now becoming something else entirely, a place without an emperor, without legions, and without a name that yet defined its future. The next chapter would not be written in Latin, but in the rough and growing tongue of newcomers who would one day call themselves English. When the Roman legions withdrew in the early 5th century, Britain was left to fend for itself, an island suddenly without its guardian. The roads still ran straight, the walls still stood firm, and the old towns bore the echoes of Latin speech, but the empire that had built them was gone. What remained was a population adrift in its own land, Romanized Britons who still clung to the habits of an empire that no longer existed. Over time, they would face the storm of migration that reshaped not only Britain but the whole of Europe. The fall of Roman Britain did not come overnight. For decades, the Romano-British elite attempted to maintain the old order. Local leaders rose in the absence of governors. Bishops replaced administrators. The Latin faith replaced imperial law. Gildas, a 6th century monk who chronicled these times in his work De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, described a society crumbling under corruption and complacency. He spoke of cities burned, of churches desecrated, and of rulers who had lost both virtue and power. His words, though moralistic and ambiguous, reflect a real disintegration of centralized authority. By the mid-5th century, the people of Britain faced new dangers. From the north came the Picts and Scots. From across the Irish Sea, raiders struck at the western coast. And from the east came the first groups of Germanic settlers, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Their origins lay in the coastal lands of modern Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, regions known to the Romans as Germania. They came first as mercenaries, invited, perhaps around AD 449, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, by a British ruler known as Vortigern, who sought help against the northern tribes. Among these newcomers were the legendary brothers Hengist and Horsa, said to have led the first Saxon warbands to Kent. They were granted land in return for their service, but as their numbers grew, conflict erupted. What began as an alliance soon turned to conquest. The newcomers realized that the island's weakness offered opportunity. By the late 5th century, waves of settlers crossed the North Sea, not just warriors, but entire families, carrying the struggle between the native Britons and the Germanic newcomers defined the 5th and 6th centuries. Fragmented British kingdoms, remnants of the Roman order, fought to survive. Some, like Dumnonia in the southwest and Powys in the west, held out longer than others. Their leaders, remembered in Welsh legend as heroes and saints, became the seeds of enduring myth. Chief among them was Arthur, a war leader whose deeds were recorded in distorted form by later chroniclers like Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth. Whether he was one man or a composite of many, Arthur represents the desperate resistance of the Britons in an age of encroaching darkness. The battle most closely linked to his legend, Mountbatten, traditionally dated between AD 490 and 516, marked a rare British victory. Gildas refers to it as the last great triumph of the Britons, halting the Saxon advance for a generation. Archaeological layers from this period show a temporary stabilization. Hill forts reoccupied, rural life briefly restored. Yet the reprieve was short-lived. By the mid-6th century, the tide turned again. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes expanded their domains across the eastern and southern regions of the island. Kent, under the Jutes, became one of the earliest established kingdoms, with its first recorded king, Ethelbert, emerging later as a central figure in England's Christianization. To the north, the Angles founded Bernicia and Dara, which would later merge into Northumbria. The Saxons, spreading westward from the Thames, formed the nuclei of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex, names that still carry their origins in West Saxons, South Saxons, and East Saxons. This was not a unified invasion, but a mosaic of settlements, each tribe carving out territory in the ruins of the old Roman world. By AD 550, the landscape of Britain had been utterly transformed. The once Romanized south and east were now largely Anglo-Saxon. The native Britons retreated into the western highlands, Wales, Cornwall, and Strathclyde. Latin influence faded, replaced by the Germanic dialects that would one day evolve into the English language. The religious transformation was equally profound. Paganism returned to a land that had once been Christian under Rome. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them their pantheon, gods like Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, reflected in the very names of the days of the week that survive to this day. Temples rose where churches once stood. Sacred groves replaced basilicas. For nearly 2 centuries, Christianity in Britain survived only in the Celtic fringes, in monasteries of Ireland, Wales, and western Scotland. But from those fringes came the seeds of revival. In AD 563, an Irish monk named Columba founded the monastery of Iona off the western coast of Scotland, which became a center of learning and missionary work. Its influence spread across the north, eventually reaching the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. At the same time, Christianity would return from the south, not from the Celts, but from Rome itself. Before that reconversion, however, the Anglo-Saxon world solidified into recognizable realms. The chronicle lists 7 major kingdoms, the so-called Heptarchy: Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. Each developed its own ruling dynasties, legal codes, and warrior aristocracies. Kings like Ida of Bernicia are 547 to 559, and Cerdic of Wessex are c. 519 to 534, laid the foundations for states that would later shape England's destiny. Trade gradually revived through coastal ports such as Hamwick, Southampton, and Londonwick, London. By the late 6th century, imported goods from the continent, glass, wine, fine pottery, began to reappear, suggesting a slow reawakening of urban life. Yet the spiritual reawakening that followed would prove even more transformative. In AD 597, under the direction of Pope Gregory the Great, a Roman monk named Augustine landed in Kent. He carried with him the mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons back to Christianity. Welcomed by King Ethelbert, whose Frankish wife, Bertha, was already Christian, Augustine established his seat at Canterbury, founding what would become the English Church. Within a generation, Kent became a beacon of Christian learning and influence. From there, Christianity spread north and west. By the early 7th century, Northumbria had embraced the faith through the work of missionaries like Paulinus and Aidan of Lindisfarne. The old pagan gods retreated, replaced by Latin scriptures and stone churches. Monasteries became centers of art, education, and record-keeping, preserving the fragile memory of a land that had nearly forgotten its past. By the end of the 6th century, the chaos of post-Roman Britain had given way to a new order. The island was no longer a Roman province nor a collection of Celtic kingdoms, but a patchwork of emerging English states. The transformation had taken nearly 2 centuries, from the first Saxon landings to the Christian revival under Augustine. The land itself had changed beyond recognition. The Roman cities lay in ruins, the great villas overgrown, but new halls of timber rose where marble had once stood. The people who tilled its fields and ruled its kingdoms spoke a new language, worshipped new gods, and carried the blood of both conquerors and conquered. In this fusion of Celtic endurance and Germanic vigor lay the foundation of a nation that did not yet bear a name, a nation that would soon learn unity through faith, conflict, and kingship. As the 7th century dawned, England was a land of contrasts. The sweeping withdrawal of Roman authority 2 centuries prior had left a mosaic of competing kingdoms, each asserting control over its patch of fertile land, river valleys, and coasts. The Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, dominated the south and east, while remnants of the native Britons held the west and north. Each kingdom was ruled by a warrior king whose authority was personal, contingent on loyalty, and enforced through oaths of allegiance, fealty, and the threat of force. Law and justice were rudimentary, often delivered by the king or local elders, relying on customary codes like the Wergild, a system of fines calculated according to the social status of the injured party. Religiously, the land was still in transition. Paganism persisted in many areas. The Anglo-Saxon pantheon, Woden, Thunor, Tiw, Frigg, and their retinue, was deeply embedded in social and cultural life. Seasonal festivals, sacrifices, and sacred groves remained central to communal identity. Archaeological evidence, including richly furnished graves and ritual deposits, illustrates that devotion to these gods remained vigorous, particularly in Mercia and Wessex. The religious life of the early 7th century was not only spiritual but political. Kings claimed divine sanction through their association with the gods, their success in battle interpreted as proof of favor from above. Yet across the Channel, a different current was rising. Christianity, carried initially from the Celtic fringes and now more forcefully from Rome, was advancing into the heart of England. In AD 597, Pope Gregory the Great dispatched a mission led by Augustine of Canterbury to the Kingdom of Kent. Augustine arrived with a small contingent of monks and clergy, tasked with converting the Anglo-Saxon rulers and establishing a permanent ecclesiastical infrastructure. His mission was not merely spiritual, it was political. Converting a king meant converting his people, and the papacy understood that faith could unify, pacify, and ultimately stabilize these turbulent territories. King Ethelbert of Kent, already influenced by his Christian Frankish wife, Bertha, welcomed Augustine. Within months, Ethelbert was baptized, and Augustine established the first archbishopric at Canterbury, founding a cathedral and a monastery that would become England's primary center of Christian administration. The introduction of Christianity brought new systems of literacy, record-keeping, and cultural exchange. Latin, previously confined to the Roman remnants, became the language of religious authority and administration. Monasteries began to serve as repositories of knowledge, preserving texts, copying manuscripts, and training clergy in reading and writing skills that were rapidly disappearing outside of these centers. The Christianization of England was gradual and uneven. Northumbria, under King Æthelfrith and later King Edwin, came under missionary influence in the early 7th century. Paulinus, sent from Augustine's mission, converted Edwin around AD 627, establishing York as a center of Christian practice. Missionaries faced the delicate task of integrating. During this century, chroniclers like Bede, writing later in AD 731, would provide invaluable testimony to the transformation taking place. In his ecclesiastical history of the English people, Bede recorded not only the progress of conversion but the interactions between kingdoms, the ebb and flow of warfare, and the fusion of old and new practices. He noted how kings increasingly used Christian institutions to consolidate authority, sponsor learning, and negotiate relations with neighboring kingdoms. Churches became political tools as well as centers of spiritual life, mediating disputes and hosting gatherings that shaped the emerging sense of an English polity. Political consolidation also began to take shape through both conquest and diplomacy. Mercia, located in the heart of the island, grew steadily in power under kings like Pinda, who ruled from approximately AD 626 to 655. Pinda was notable for his resistance to Christianity. He remained a staunch pagan even as neighboring kingdoms converted. His reign illustrates the religious tension of the period, where political authority did not always align with spiritual allegiance. Nevertheless, Mercia's military campaigns extended influence over East Anglia, Wessex, and the Thames Valley, forming the nucleus of a kingdom that would dominate southern England in the coming century. Meanwhile, Northumbria experienced alternating periods of pagan resurgence and Christian consolidation. After King Edwin died in 633, pagan leaders briefly regained influence, yet Christianity persisted, carried forward by missionaries and the enduring presence of monasteries. Hilda of Whitby, who established the Whitby Abbey around AD 657, became a leading figure in religious education and cultural synthesis, bridging Celtic and Roman traditions. Whitby Abbey would later host the Synod of Whitby in 664, a defining moment where the English Church aligned with Roman rather than Celtic practices, setting the stage for ecclesiastical unity across the island. Trade and cultural exchange also accelerated in this period. Coastal kingdoms like Kent and East Anglia maintained connections with the Frankish and Scandinavian world, importing wine, luxury goods, and manuscripts. Coinage, modeled after continental examples, circulated widely, providing evidence of economic integration and royal authority. Social hierarchies became increasingly complex, with nobles, warrior elites, clergy, and commoners interacting in a landscape shaped by both Germanic customs and the lingering influence of Rome. By the late 7th century, the convergence of faith and kingship had begun to create the first tangible sense of an English identity, though the island remained fragmented. Latin texts preserved knowledge of Roman Britain, monasteries recorded local events, and Christian kings increasingly used written law codes to govern their people. For instance, King Ethelbert of Kent had issued one of the earliest known Anglo-Saxon law codes, blending customary tribal law with Roman legal influence and Christian ethical principles. Law, literacy, and religion were now intertwined, laying the groundwork for a more cohesive society. Even amid religious transformation, the old ways did not disappear entirely. Pagan symbols and motifs persisted in burial practices, metalwork, and art. The Anglo-Saxon worldview remained deeply entwined with notions of fate, honor, and martial prowess. Yet Christianity offered new narratives of moral order, salvation, and divine kingship, providing a unifying framework that transcended individual kingdoms. By AD 700, England stood at a crossroads. Pagan kingdoms had not been fully eradicated, yet Christianity had established permanent footholds. Monasteries and cathedrals dotted the landscape. Literacy and record-keeping were taking root. The authority of kings was increasingly legitimized by spiritual sanction. England was no longer merely a patchwork of warring tribes. It was evolving into a land where faith, law, and monarchy could coexist, however tenuously, across diverse and often hostile territories. As the 8th century dawned, England's political landscape was marked by flux and ambition. The Northumbrian kingdoms that had flourished during the 7th century began to wane under internal strife and external pressure, while the southern and central kingdoms were poised to seize influence. Among these, Mercia, located in the Midlands, emerged as the preeminent power under the leadership of King Offa, r. 757 to 796, whose reign would leave an indelible mark on English history. Offa inherited a kingdom that had been shaped by decades of territorial consolidation and intermittent warfare. He built upon the efforts of his predecessors to assert Mercian dominance over neighboring realms, including Kent, Sussex, Essex, and East Anglia. Through a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, and alliances, Offa extended his influence across much of southern and central England. His authority was so recognized that he bore the title Bretwalda, a term used to denote an overlord of several kingdoms, suggesting a degree of supremacy over the fragmented Heptarchy. One of Offa's most enduring achievements was the construction of Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork stretching approximately 150 miles along the border with Wales. This formidable structure served both defensive and symbolic purposes, delineating Mercia from the native Welsh kingdoms. It represented the projection of Mercian power, a statement of territorial control, and a warning to potential invaders. The dike was not merely a military fortification, but a demonstration of Offa's ability to mobilize resources, labor, and engineering expertise on a grand scale. Economically, Offa's reign witnessed significant developments. He introduced a standardized coinage system that reflected Mercia's prosperity and influence. Silver pennies minted in London and other Mercian towns bore Latin inscriptions and royal imagery, facilitating trade both within England and with continental Europe. These coins attest to an increasingly sophisticated economy, capable of supporting complex networks of exchange, taxation, and administration. Trade routes extended to the Frankish realms, where Offa negotiated treaties and even attempted marriage alliances, demonstrating the kingdom's engagement with broader European politics. Culturally, Mercia under Offa became a center of learning and religious patronage. Monasteries continued to serve as repositories of knowledge, producing manuscripts and chronicling events, while also providing spiritual guidance. Latin literacy flourished among the clergy, ensuring that religious, legal, and historical records were maintained. Christianity, now firmly established across southern England, provided a unifying framework for these diverse polities. The Church, working in tandem with the monarchy, helped to legitimize Offa's rule and to promote social cohesion in a region still marked by localized identities and competing tribal loyalties. Offa's dominance, however, was not unchallenged. The northern kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia remained centers of resistance, occasionally rebelling against Mercian authority. In addition, Welsh kingdoms to the west continued to contest Mercian expansion. Offa's strategy combined both force and diplomacy. He waged campaigns to subdue rebellious territories, while forging alliances through marriage and negotiation. His careful balancing of coercion and conciliation allowed Mercia to maintain supremacy for nearly 4 decades, a remarkable achievement in an era defined by volatile succession and constant warfare. The period also witnessed significant religious developments. The Church served as both a spiritual and political institution, mediating disputes between kingdoms and providing legitimacy for rulers. Offa corresponded with Pope Adrian I, seeking to establish an archbishopric at Lichfield, which temporarily elevated Mercia's ecclesiastical status to rival that of Canterbury. This move reflected Offa's ambition not merely to dominate militarily, but to assert cultural and religious leadership within England. The creation of the Lichfield archbishopric, though later reversed, demonstrated the interplay between secular power and ecclesiastical authority, highlighting the sophistication of early medieval statecraft. Under Offa, England was beginning to see the early signs of national identity. While regional loyalties remained strong, the notion of a broader political and cultural unity was emerging, facilitated by the overlapping influences of monarchy, church, and shared legal codes. Law codes from this period reveal an increasing complexity in governance. Disputes were regulated, fines codified, and social hierarchies formalized, reflecting a society moving beyond purely The 8th century in southern England was a period of state-building, cultural consolidation, and relative prosperity under dominant powers such as Mercia. Offa's reign exemplified the possibilities of centralized authority, economic development, and strategic diplomacy, laying the foundations for the England that would confront the coming Viking Age. Monasteries preserved knowledge, law codes formalized governance, and monumental works like Offa's Dyke symbolized the assertion of territorial and political identity. The era was not free from conflict, but it demonstrated the capacity of southern kingdoms to wield sustained influence, shaping the political map of England in ways that would resonate for centuries. The foundation laid during this period, combining military strength, economic sophistication, and ecclesiastical authority, would be tested in the decades ahead, as northern and eastern coasts faced incursions that demanded new strategies, unity, and resilience. The dawn of the 9th century brought a new and relentless challenge to the kingdoms of England, the Vikings. Born of the cold fjords and coastal inlets of Scandinavia, these seafaring raiders would arrive in longships to strike fear into the hearts of Anglo-Saxon England. The first recorded attack came in AD 793, when the monastery at Lindisfarne, on the northeast coast, was raided. Chroniclers described the violence with horror: monks slain, treasures looted, and sacred texts destroyed. This attack, though only the opening salvo of a wider upheaval, marked the beginning of the so-called Viking Age in England. The Lindisfarne raid was a shock not only for its brutality, but for its audacity. Monasteries, often situated in isolated coastal or riverside locations, were vulnerable yet represented immense wealth, silver, gold, and sacred relics. The Vikings' ability to strike suddenly and withdraw into the sea confounded the slow, land-bound Anglo-Saxon militias. What had once been largely internal conflict among kingdoms now became a confrontation with a new, external, and highly mobile enemy. Throughout the early 9th century, raiding became more frequent. Smaller bands struck along the coasts of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Wessex. These attacks were opportunistic at first, looting settlements, capturing slaves, and testing the defenses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Yet the pattern quickly escalated. By AD 865, the Vikings arrived in force. Known in the sources as the Great Heathen Army, this coalition of warriors, led by figures such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, was no longer interested in mere plunder. They came to conquer, settle, and establish kingdoms of their own. The impact of the Great Heathen Army was immediate and devastating. Northumbria fell rapidly. The Kingdom of York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, became their base of power in the north. East Anglia, too, suffered, with its king captured and executed according to some chronicles. Mercia and Wessex resisted, but the cohesion of southern defenses was repeatedly tested. Local militias, comprised largely of levies raised from the peasantry, could not match the experienced, organized forces of the Norse invaders. The traditional Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced an unprecedented existential threat. In response, leaders across England were forced to innovate militarily. The Anglo-Saxon kings began to organize fortified towns designed to protect populations and resist Viking assault. Wessex, in particular, under the leadership of King Alfred the Great, would later refine these strategies, creating a network of strongholds connected by watchtowers and roads that allowed rapid mobilization of forces. But in the early years of the invasion, the Viking advantage was clear: their mobility, superior maritime skill, and psychological impact gave them near total control over the territories they targeted. The Vikings did not merely raid, they imposed new laws, customs, and economic structures where they settled. The territories under their control, collectively known as the Danelaw, stretched across much of northern and eastern England. Here, Norse law prevailed alongside traditional Anglo-Saxon practices, creating a hybrid culture. Archaeology reveals longhouses, weapon burials, and imported Scandinavian goods in these areas, evidence of permanent settlement rather than transient raiding. Place names, too, from Derby to Grimsby, testify to Norse influence, marking the landscape with the memory of conquest. Religious and cultural life in England also shifted under Viking pressure. Many monasteries were destroyed in early raids, disrupting centers of learning and literacy. Yet over time, Norse settlers converted to Christianity, often integrating with Anglo-Saxon communities. Churches were rebuilt. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were eventually reoccupied, and Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures fused in ways that would leave a lasting legacy on the English language, law, and societal structure. Amid the chaos, the southern kingdom of Wessex emerged as the principal bulwark against Viking domination. Unlike Northumbria and East Anglia, Wessex maintained relative stability and developed strategies to survive. King Æthelwulf, r. 839 to 858, and his successors sought both to defend their lands and to negotiate when necessary. Fortified towns and mobile militias became essential. Tribute payments, known as Danegeld, were used strategically, not merely as capitulation, but as a means to buy time, preserve forces, and prepare for counterattacks. By the late 860s, the full scope of the Viking threat was apparent. The Great Heathen Army had established fortified camps, launched multiple campaigns, and even wintered in conquered territories, demonstrating both strategic planning and endurance. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fragmented and regionally focused, struggled to coordinate a unified response. It was a period of near-apocalyptic upheaval, where the very survival of the English kingdoms hung in the balance. Yet adversity bred innovation. Wessex's leaders, particularly Alfred the Great, later in the century, learned to adapt. Naval forces were improved, fortified towns expanded, and intelligence networks established to monitor Viking movements. Diplomacy became an essential tool. Alliances with Mercia, Kent, and even some Viking factions allowed Wessex to stabilize key regions. The process of resisting the Norse invaders laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England. The Viking Age also accelerated social and economic transformation. Northern and eastern regions under Danelaw adopted Norse administrative practices, while southern kingdoms refined Anglo-Saxon governance to mobilize resources efficiently. Coinage was standardized, trade networks reorganized, and legal codes updated to address both internal order and external threat. Literacy and record-keeping, though disrupted in some areas, persisted in monasteries, preserving knowledge of the land's history and the deeds of its rulers. By AD 870, the stage was set for one of England's most pivotal figures to emerge. The Northumbrian and Eastern territories were largely under Norse control, but Wessex remained resilient. Into this crucible stepped Alfred, a young king whose vision, military acumen, and commitment to learning would alter the trajectory of England's formation. The Viking incursions, though destructive, catalyzed the evolution of governance, defense, and cultural synthesis, forcing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to adapt to unprecedented circumstances. The significance of this period cannot be overstated. The Viking invasions were not merely a series of raids, but a transformative force, reshaping political boundaries, social structures, and cultural identities. The introduction of Norse law, settlement patterns, and linguistic influences left a lasting imprint, while the necessity of resistance fostered the emergence of stronger, more centralized authority in the southern kingdoms. England, once a collection of fragile and disconnected realms, was beginning to coalesce under the pressure of external threat. As the 870s closed, England's landscape was a tapestry of conquest and resilience. Northumbria, East Anglia, and large portions of Mercia were under Norse influence, while Wessex and the western fringes held firm. Monasteries, though scarred by raids, continued to function as centers of learning and spiritual life. Trade, though disrupted, adapted to new realities, linking surviving Anglo-Saxon towns with continental markets and Norse settlements. The experience of repeated conflict, negotiation, and survival forged a society capable of both resistance and synthesis, the foundations of a unified English identity. Thus, the era from 793 to 870 established the enduring dialectic of English history: invasion and settlement, destruction and renewal, conflict and integration. The Vikings brought terror and Æthelstan ascended the throne of Wessex in AD 924, inheriting a kingdom that had been strengthened through Alfred's reforms and the subsequent reigns of his father Edward the Elder and his half-brother Alfward. While Wessex and Mercia were relatively secure, northern and eastern England remained under the influence of the Vikings, particularly in the remnants of the Danelaw. This division posed both military and political challenges, as Æthelstan had to assert dominance over territories that had previously resisted Anglo-Saxon rule. His ambition, however, was unmatched: to create a kingdom encompassing all of England, from the Humber to the Thames and beyond. One of Æthelstan's first significant achievements came in AD 927, when he marched north to confront the last Viking stronghold in York, then a center of Norse power. By defeating the Viking forces and securing the loyalty of their leaders, Æthelstan effectively ended Viking political dominance in northern England. This victory marked a turning point in the consolidation of England, as it brought the north under his authority and extended the reach of the Wessex-based monarchy. From that moment, Æthelstan could claim the title of the first king of all England, a milestone celebrated by contemporary chroniclers and remembered as a defining moment in the nation's formation. Æthelstan's consolidation of power was not achieved solely through military might. He was an astute diplomat, forging alliances through marriage, treaties, and the careful integration of local elites. Nobles from conquered or absorbed territories were incorporated into his court, often receiving lands or positions of authority. This strategy helped to stabilize regions that might otherwise have resisted central rule. Furthermore, Æthelstan cultivated relations with continental powers, including the kings of France, Germany, and Burgundy, demonstrating that England was now an entity capable of participating in European politics as a unified kingdom. Legal reform was another cornerstone of Æthelstan's reign. Building upon Alfred's codifications, Æthelstan issued laws that extended across his unified kingdom, blending Anglo-Saxon customary law, Christian moral principles, and administrative standards suitable for a diverse population. These codes addressed property rights, social hierarchies, and criminal justice, providing a coherent framework for governance that reinforced royal authority. By standardizing law across England, Æthelstan strengthened the bonds between previously autonomous regions, fostering a sense of shared identity and common order. Religious policy was equally integral to Æthelstan's consolidation. He maintained the close relationship between the crown and the church established under Alfred, supporting bishops, monasteries, and ecclesiastical institutions. Æthelstan convened councils, such as the Council of Greatly in 929, to regulate ecclesiastical matters and assert royal oversight of the church. Monastic reform and the promotion of literacy continued, ensuring that religious institutions not only nurtured spiritual life, but also contributed to governance, record-keeping, and cultural continuity. By integrating ecclesiastical authority with royal power, Æthelstan reinforced both political control and the moral legitimacy of his reign. The Battle of Brennenburg in AD 937 stands as Æthelstan's crowning military achievement and a decisive moment in English history. Facing a coalition of Norse, Scottish, and Strathclyde Briton forces, Æthelstan's army secured a comprehensive victory, crushing the alliance that sought to challenge his supremacy. Contemporary chroniclers, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, hailed this battle as one of the greatest triumphs of the age, emphasizing its significance for the preservation and expansion of England as a unified polity. The victory at Brennenburg not only consolidated Æthelstan's territorial authority, but also established the perception of invincibility and legitimacy that would endure for generations. Æthelstan's reign also fostered economic integration and cultural exchange. Coinage was standardized across the kingdom, facilitating trade and the collection of tribute. Markets and towns flourished, serving as centers of commerce, administration, and communication. These urban centers reflected the merging of Anglo-Saxon and Viking practices, particularly in areas previously under Danelaw control, highlighting the ongoing process of cultural synthesis. The circulation of coins, legal documents, and written charters reinforced the authority of the crown and the sense of belonging to a single polity. Education and literacy, crucial elements of Alfred's reforms, continued to thrive under Æthelstan. He maintained patronage of monasteries, which remained the primary centers of learning and record-keeping. Religious and historical texts were copied and preserved, while literacy among clergy and administrators supported the functioning of government. This intellectual infrastructure allowed Æthelstan to communicate effectively across his kingdom, maintain bureaucratic control, and document legal and military actions. Written records, including charters and annals, contributed to the sense of an enduring national history, anchoring the identity of the English people in both past achievements and contemporary governance. One notable feature of Æthelstan's rule was his emphasis on ceremony and symbolism. Royal charters, coronations, and public proclamations reinforced the unity of the kingdom and projected authority. Æthelstan styled himself as Rex Totius Britanniae, or King of all Britain, signaling a claim not only over England but also asserting prestige in relation to neighboring territories. This assertion of kingship was not empty rhetoric. It reflected both military conquest and the administrative integration of multiple regions under a central authority. Through such symbols, Æthelstan cultivated a sense of legitimacy and continuity that strengthened his position both domestically and abroad. Despite these successes, challenges remained. Viking influence persisted in some northern areas, and Scotland, Wales, and other neighboring polities occasionally tested Æthelstan's authority. Nevertheless, the political, military, and cultural framework he established enabled a degree of resilience that previous Anglo-Saxon rulers could not achieve. The unification of England under Æthelstan was not merely the conquest of territory. It was the creation of institutions, legal norms, and cultural cohesion that endured beyond his lifetime. By the end of his reign in AD 939, Æthelstan had secured the foundations of a unified England. The previously fragmented kingdoms, divided by regional loyalties, linguistic differences, and Viking settlements, were now bound together under a single crown, supported by law, military organization, and ecclesiastical authority. Æthelstan's reign represents the culmination of centuries of transformation, from the Roman withdrawal and Anglo-Saxon settlement to Alfred's reforms and resistance to the Viking threat, coalescing into a coherent and centralized polity. The legacy of Æthelstan's rule was profound. His military victories, diplomatic successes, legal reforms, and promotion of literacy and religion established patterns that would shape the English monarchy for centuries. The idea of a unified English kingdom, defended by a strong central authority and reinforced through cultural and religious cohesion, became a durable reality. This period set the stage for subsequent rulers to maintain and expand the concept of England as a single political entity, laying the foundation for the nation-state that would continue to evolve in the High Middle Ages. After the reign of Æthelstan, who had successfully unified England and asserted authority over the previously fragmented kingdoms, the nation entered a period of renewed instability. The fragile unity forged under Alfred the Great and his successors faced new challenges as Viking activity resumed, this time in the form of large-scale Danish invasions. The decades following Æthelstan's death in AD 939 witnessed a series of rulers grappling with both internal succession disputes and the relentless pressure of North Sea raiders seeking to claim territory, wealth, and power. England's northern and eastern regions, though nominally under Anglo-Saxon control, remained vulnerable to incursions. Denmark, Norway, and the broader Scandinavian world were experiencing political consolidation and population pressures, prompting ambitious warlords and kings to seek fortunes abroad. The Vikings, who had previously settled in the Danelaw and other territories, retained a presence and cultural influence, blending into local society but also serving as a base for renewed military campaigns. These developments culminated in a major invasion under the leadership of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Anglo-Saxon kings struggled to mount a coordinated defense. Following Æthelstan, rulers such as Edmund R. 939 to 946 and Eadred R. 946 to 955 continued the work of maintaining unity, but they faced persistent raids, internal dissent, and the challenge of governing territories with lingering Viking sympathies. These kings relied heavily on fortified towns and local militias, a system inherited from Alfred, but the scale and frequency of Viking. By the early 11th century, Danish ambitions intensified. Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion in AD 1013, forcing King Æthelred the Unready to flee England. Sweyn's conquest marked the first time a Scandinavian king ruled the entire island. Though his reign was brief, Sweyn died in AD 1014, It set the stage for the eventual establishment of a Danish dynasty. Æthelred returned to the throne following Sweyn's death, but his rule remained troubled by continued Danish pressure, including raids and the presence of powerful Norse lords within England. The situation reached a climax under Knut the Great, Sweyn's son, who emerged as a decisive figure in England's history. Following years of conflict and negotiation, Knut invaded England and defeated Æthelred's son, Edmund Ironside, at the Battle of Æthelstan in AD 1016. This victory allowed Knut to secure control over the entire kingdom. He ruled England not as a mere conqueror, but as a skilled administrator, integrating Danish and Anglo-Saxon institutions to create a stable North Sea empire encompassing Denmark, Norway, and England. Knut's reign, from AD 1016 to 1035, represented a period of relative peace, stability, and prosperity. He maintained the legal and administrative structures established by Alfred and his successors, ensuring continuity despite the change in dynasty. Knut respected existing Anglo-Saxon laws, supported the church, and preserved the system of fortified towns and military organization that had proven effective against previous invasions. His governance demonstrated that the integration of Viking and Anglo-Saxon systems could produce a cohesive and functioning kingdom. Economically, Knut's rule promoted trade and fiscal stability. England, under the Danish king, remained an important hub of commerce within the North Sea and with continental Europe. Towns like London, York, and Winchester flourished, benefiting from both domestic stability and access to wider trade networks. Coinage circulated widely, standardizing commerce and reinforcing the authority of the crown across culturally diverse territories. The Danish administration also maintained records, conducted surveys, and regulated taxation, ensuring the integration of all parts of the kingdom into a functioning state. Culturally, Knut's reign was characterized by a blending of Anglo-Saxon and Danish influences. While the king himself adhered to Christian practices, Norse traditions persisted among the nobility and in regions formerly under Danelaw control. Over time, these cultural interactions facilitated the assimilation of Danish settlers into English society, creating a hybrid identity that would influence language, legal customs, and social norms. Monasteries continued to serve as centers of literacy and record-keeping, preserving the memory of the Anglo-Saxon past while accommodating the realities of Danish rule. After Knut died in AD 1035, his sons attempted to maintain control, but their reigns were short-lived and marked by political instability. The Danish dynasty gradually lost its grip on England, creating an opportunity for the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon line. In AD 1042, Edward the Confessor, son of Æthelred the Unready, ascended the throne. His reign restored the Wessex dynasty and provided continuity for Anglo-Saxon governance, while maintaining the institutional improvements and cultural integration achieved under Knut. Edward's rule would last until AD 1066, marking the end of the Anglo-Saxon period and setting the stage for the Norman Conquest. The period from AD 940 to 1042 thus represents a crucial chapter in the formation of England. It was a time of renewed external threat, Danish conquest, and cultural synthesis. The Northmen's return challenged the political and military resilience of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, yet it also prompted innovations in governance, law, and defense. By adapting to these pressures, integrating diverse populations, and maintaining continuity, England emerged from this period stronger, more centralized, and better prepared for the challenges of the late 11th century. Throughout these decades, England's identity continued to evolve. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Danish elements created a society that could absorb external influences without losing its core institutions. Laws, coinage, military organization, and religious structures endured, providing stability even amidst frequent succession crises and regional uprisings. The successful governance under both Anglo-Saxon and Danish rulers demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of England's political and cultural framework. The restoration of the Anglo-Saxon line in AD 1042 with the ascension of Edward the Confessor marked a period of relative stability in England, yet the kingdom was perched on the edge of a profound transformation. Edward, the son of Æthelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, had spent much of his early life in exile in Normandy, returning to claim the throne as a king shaped by both Anglo-Saxon and continental influences. His reign, from 1042 to 1066, would be defined by efforts to maintain peace among England's powerful noble families, strengthen ecclesiastical institutions, and navigate the growing threat of succession crises that would ultimately invite foreign intervention. Edward's rule was characterized by piety and a close relationship with the Church. He emphasized the importance of religious observance, monastic reform, and architectural patronage. Most notably, Edward commissioned the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, laying the foundation for a structure that would become central to English religious and political life. Beyond its spiritual significance, Westminster represented Edward's vision of a kingdom unified not only under his rule, but also under the moral and cultural guidance of the Church. Monasteries and cathedral schools flourished under royal patronage, ensuring the continuation of literacy, scholarship, and administrative competence, all essential for governing a kingdom that had endured centuries of external threats and internal fragmentation. Edward's diplomacy was equally significant. As a king with ties to Normandy and experience of continental courts, he maintained correspondence and alliances across Europe, including with France and the Holy Roman Empire. These connections reinforced England's status as a recognized kingdom within the broader Christian world. Additionally, Edward navigated relations with powerful domestic magnates, most notably the Godwin family, whose influence extended across southern England. Balancing the ambitions of these nobles required careful negotiation, occasional displays of force, and strategic appointments to key offices. Through this delicate management, Edward sought to maintain the unity and stability of his kingdom. Despite these efforts, Edward's lack of a direct heir created a growing crisis. By the 1060s, the question of succession loomed large. Edward had been married, but the union produced no children, leaving the throne vulnerable to competing claims. The Anglo-Saxon succession system, while favoring hereditary continuity, allowed for the influence of the Witan, the Council of Nobles, in confirming or selecting the next king. This ambiguity invited challenges both from domestic claimants and from foreign powers with ties to the English crown. Among the most significant claimants was Harold Godwin's son, the son of Earl Godwin of Wessex, a man whose influence, military experience, and proximity to the throne positioned him as the most viable successor. However, Edward's Norman connections also played a crucial role in the succession crisis. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne during Edward's lifetime, bolstered by Norman support and oaths of allegiance taken by English nobles. This claim would justify what would become the Norman invasion of 1066. The convergence of Anglo-Saxon internal politics and continental ambition set the stage for a pivotal confrontation, one that would end centuries of Anglo-Saxon rule and inaugurate a new dynasty in England. The political landscape in 1066 was marked by a series of military mobilizations and strategic responses. In September of that year, Harold Godwin's son faced an invasion from King Harald Hardrada of Norway, who sought to claim England with the support of the Northern Earls. Harold successfully defeated Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, demonstrating his military skill and the resilience of Anglo-Saxon forces. Yet the victory came at a cost. Harold's army was exhausted, his forces depleted, and the threat from the south, William of Normandy, loomed imminent. Barely 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold had to march his troops south to confront William's invasion. William, claiming the English throne by right of Edward's promise, landed in Sussex with a well-prepared, culturally. The Norman Conquest introduced new languages, architecture, and legal practices. French became the language of the court, administration, and aristocracy, while Old English persisted among the common people. Over time, the two languages blended, influencing the evolution of Middle English. Ecclesiastical reforms under the Normans drew upon the Church's earlier Anglo-Saxon structures, but emphasized alignment with continental practices and papal authority. The blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norman elements ultimately produced a hybrid culture, shaping the trajectory of English identity for centuries to come. The significance of Edward the Confessor's reign lies not only in the events leading to the Norman Conquest, but also in the structures and precedents he reinforced. By maintaining a network of loyal nobles, supporting the Church, promoting literacy, and ensuring administrative continuity, Edward left a legacy that would influence both Anglo-Saxon and Norman governance. His death without an heir, however, exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in succession systems dependent on both hereditary claim and noble consensus, underscoring the precarious balance of power that had characterized England for centuries. By the time William the Conqueror was crowned on Christmas Day, 1066, England had transitioned from a kingdom forged by Roman, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Viking influences into a realm transformed by Norman rule. The conquest did not erase the past. Rather, it integrated centuries of social, legal, and cultural development into a new political order. The structures, identities, and institutions established during the Anglo-Saxon period provided the framework upon which the Normans built, ensuring continuity even amid revolutionary change. The period from AD 1042 to 1066 thus represents both an ending and a beginning. It concludes the millennium-long process of England's formation, from the Roman invasion of AD 43 through the Anglo-Saxon settlement, Viking incursions, and the consolidation under Alfred and Æthelstan, while simultaneously setting the stage for the transformation under Norman authority. Edward the Confessor's reign bridged these epochs, preserving the achievements of the Anglo-Saxon era even as his death precipitated a dramatic reordering of the kingdom. The legacy of this period is multifaceted. Politically, it underscores the importance of succession planning, diplomatic alliances, and the integration of external influences. Militarily, it highlights the evolution of defensive strategies, militia organization, and the ability of leaders to respond to simultaneous threats from multiple directions. Culturally and religiously, Edward's patronage of the Church, promotion of learning, and architectural projects ensured that Anglo-Saxon identity and institutions endured, providing a foundation for the subsequent Norman synthesis. Following the consolidation of England under Æthelstan in AD 939, the kingdom entered a period of relative unity and centralized governance. Æthelstan's successors maintained the political structures, legal frameworks, and cultural cohesion he had established, yet the shadow of the Northmen, the Vikings who had long contested control of the British Isles, loomed large. In the decades after his death, renewed Scandinavian ambition, combined with internal dynastic vulnerabilities, would test the resilience of England and ultimately reshape the trajectory of its monarchy. The Anglo-Saxon kings who followed Æthelstan, notably Edmund I, r. 939 to 946, and Eadred, r. 946 to 955, faced the daunting task of defending territories still under Viking influence, particularly in the north and east areas historically identified with the Danelaw. These regions had retained Norse legal customs, settlement patterns, and cultural practices, making them both politically and culturally distinct from Wessex and southern England. The challenge for these kings was not merely military, it was also administrative and diplomatic. Ensuring loyalty among nobles and local leaders who maintained Viking affiliations required careful negotiation, strategic marriages, and occasional coercion. The persistent threat of Danish raiders manifested in both large-scale invasions and smaller, sporadic attacks on towns and coastal settlements. One of the most significant events in this period was the Battle of Malden in AD 991, where Viking forces led by Olaf Tryggvason confronted the Anglo-Saxon defenders. Though the English suffered defeat, the engagement demonstrated the enduring resilience of local militias and fortified towns, illustrating the lessons learned from Alfred's reforms decades earlier. Following the battle, the English agreed to pay Danegeld, a tribute intended to forestall further raids. But the payment simultaneously encouraged additional Scandinavian expeditions, revealing the double-edged nature of monetary concessions in diplomacy and conflict. During the early 11th century, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, intensified the Danish effort to dominate England. Sweyn's invasions capitalized on the kingdom's dynastic fragility and the ongoing pressure from northern earls who either supported him or sought to exploit instability for personal gain. By AD 1013, Sweyn's campaign had effectively forced King Æthelred the Unready into exile. The Danish king's brief rule represented the first instance of a Scandinavian monarch controlling the entire kingdom, an unprecedented development in English history. Though Sweyn died in AD 1014, leaving a temporary vacuum, his conquests set the stage for the ascendance of his son, Knut the Great, and the formal establishment of a Danish dynasty. Knut's campaigns were methodical and strategic. By AD 1016, he confronted and defeated Edmund Ironside, Æthelred's son, at the Battle of Æthelstan, thereby consolidating control over all of England. Knut's approach to kingship combined military authority with administrative integration. Unlike earlier invaders, he sought to blend Danish and Anglo-Saxon governance rather than impose rule solely through force. He retained key Anglo-Saxon officials, upheld established laws, and respected the church, recognizing that political stability required continuity as much as conquest. This pragmatic strategy enabled Knut to maintain power across a culturally and geographically diverse kingdom. The Danish reign under Knut, from AD 1016 to 1035, marked a period of relative peace, prosperity, and consolidation. Towns and trading centers flourished as England became a hub of commerce within the North Sea Empire, which included Denmark, Norway, and parts of modern Sweden. Coinage circulated widely, standardizing trade and reinforcing royal authority. England's integration into broader European economic networks strengthened under Knut, with ports like London, York, and Winchester benefiting from the stability provided by his administration. This period also highlights the continuity of administrative structures established by the Anglo-Saxon kings, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of English governance. Culturally, the integration of Danish and Anglo-Saxon elements shaped society in profound ways. While Knut himself adopted Christian practices, Norse traditions persisted, particularly among the nobility in former Danelaw territories. Legal codes and local customs were negotiated and reconciled, producing a hybrid culture that incorporated elements from both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon norms. This cultural synthesis influenced language, law, and social practices, demonstrating that conquest could lead not only to domination, but also to the blending of traditions and identities. Religious institutions played a central role during Knut's reign. The king maintained close relations with the church, supporting bishops, monasteries, and abbeys while ensuring that ecclesiastical authority reinforced royal power. Monastic centers continued to serve as hubs of learning, literacy, and administration, preserving Anglo-Saxon intellectual traditions while accommodating the realities of Danish governance. Charters, legal documents, and records of royal grants produced during this period reflect both continuity with the past and the practical integration of new cultural influences. Despite these achievements, the Danish dynasty faced challenges. Knut's sons, Harald Harefoot and Harthacnut, Knut, ruled briefly and encountered internal resistance, factionalism among nobles, and external pressures from Scandinavia. Their short reigns revealed the vulnerabilities of dynastic succession, particularly in a kingdom still negotiating the balance between Anglo-Saxon traditions and foreign rule. By AD 1042, the English crown returned to the Wessex line with the ascension of Edward the Confessor, restoring the native dynasty and reinforcing the institutional and cultural achievements established by Alfred, Æthelstan, and their successors. The period from AD 940 to 1042 illustrates by the conclusion of AD 1066, England had transformed dramatically. The death of Edward the Confessor and the victory of William at Hastings ended 1,000 years of incremental formation, unification, and adaptation, ushering in a new era. The political, social, and cultural achievements of the Anglo-Saxon period, from the Roman legions to Alfred's reforms, Æthelstan's unification, and the Danish interlude, had laid the foundation for a resilient kingdom capable of incorporating new influences while preserving its essential structures. From the moment the Roman legions of Emperor Claudius first set foot on British shores in AD 43, the story of England was a tale of conquest, settlement, and transformation. For over a millennium, the island witnessed waves of external influence and internal consolidation, each leaving its imprint on the land, the people, and the institutions that would ultimately define the English nation. The Romans brought roads, towns, law, and administration, establishing a framework of governance that endured long after their departure in AD 410. Their presence introduced urban planning, engineering, and literacy, laying foundations upon which later generations would build. After Rome's withdrawal, Britain entered the shadowed era of the sub-Roman period, AD 410 to 450, marked by the collapse of centralized administration and the rise of local warlords. Amid this uncertainty, native Britons struggled to maintain identity and survival while facing incursions from Picts, Scots, and Saxons. The invitation of Germanic mercenaries, initially intended for defense, set the stage for the permanent settlement of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. By AD 450, these new arrivals had begun transforming the cultural, linguistic, and political landscape of the island, establishing the foundations of what would become Anglo-Saxon England. Over the next 2 centuries, the Heptarchy, the 7 kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, competed for dominance. Constant warfare, alliances, and migrations shaped the social and political order. Yet it was through both struggle and adaptation that a distinctive Anglo-Saxon identity emerged. Christianity, reintroduced by figures such as Saint Augustine of Canterbury in AD 597, merged with older Celtic traditions, giving rise to a unified religious and cultural framework. Monasteries became centers of learning, literacy, and record-keeping, exemplified by the monumental work of Bede in AD 731, preserving knowledge for posterity. The 8th and 9th centuries saw shifts in power as Mercia under Offa rose to prominence, while the north faced a new external threat, the Vikings. Beginning with the raid on Lindisfarne in AD 793, Norse incursions escalated into the Great Heathen Army of 865, reshaping northern and eastern England into the Danelaw. These invasions tested the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, yet leaders like Alfred the Great, r. 871 to 899, defended Wessex, instituted administrative and educational reforms, and laid the foundations for a sense of unified English identity. Alfred's successors, particularly Æthelstan, r. 924 to 939, consolidated territories, defeated the last Viking strongholds, and became the first rulers of a unified England, securing both political and cultural cohesion. Despite the emergence of a united kingdom, the 10th and early 11th centuries brought further challenges. Danish influence returned under Knut the Great, who ruled from AD 1016 to 1035, blending Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian governance, law, and culture. His reign demonstrated the kingdom's capacity to absorb foreign rule while maintaining continuity, stability, and prosperity. Subsequent rulers, including Harold Harefoot, Harthacnut, and Edward the Confessor, navigated dynastic complexities, internal noble rivalries, and the looming threat of continental intervention, reflecting the fragile yet enduring nature of the English polity. The final turning point arrived in AD 1066, when Edward's death without an heir triggered the succession crisis that would culminate in the Battle of Hastings. Harold Godwin's son, the last Anglo-Saxon king, fell defending his crown, and William, Duke of Normandy, secured victory, inaugurating the Norman Conquest. This event marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon era and the beginning of a transformed England, one that integrated centuries of Roman order, Celtic resilience, Anglo-Saxon governance, and Viking influence into a kingdom capable of evolving under new rule. By the close of this millennium-spanning journey, England had emerged as a unified realm, forged through invasions, migrations, rebellions, and consolidations. From the Roman legions to Alfred's defensive reforms, Æthelstan's unification, the Danish interlude, and the ultimate Norman conquest, the identity of the English people had been shaped by a succession of historical forces. Language, law, religion, culture, and governance were not simply inherited but continually adapted, producing a society resilient to internal and external pressures. The history of how England was formed is more than a story of conquest or kingship. It is a chronicle of transformation, adaptation, and synthesis. The kingdom that stood in AD 1066 was not the patchwork of tribal lands first encountered by the Romans, nor merely the collection of Saxon and Viking territories. It was a complex, unified entity, born of centuries of interaction, negotiation, and resilience, prepared to face the challenges of a new era under Norman rule. From the shores of Roman Britain to the heights of Norman ambition, the land and people who would call themselves English were forged through conflict, governance, culture, and adaptation. The stage was set, and England, as a unified kingdom, had emerged from over a millennium of historical evolution, ready to shape its destiny in ways that would reverberate across Europe and beyond. By the conclusion of AD 1066, England had transformed dramatically. The death of Edward the Confessor and the victory of William at Hastings ended 1,000 years of incremental formation, unification, and adaptation, ushering in a new era. The political, social, and cultural achievements of the Anglo-Saxon period, from the Roman legions to Alfred's reforms, Æthelstan's unification, and the Danish interlude, had laid the foundation for a resilient kingdom capable of incorporating new influences while preserving its essential structures. From the moment the Roman legions of Emperor Claudius first set foot on British shores in AD 43, the story of England was a tale of conquest, settlement, and transformation. For over a millennium, the island witnessed waves of external influence and internal consolidation, each leaving its imprint on the land, the people, and the institutions that would ultimately define the English nation. The Romans brought roads, towns, law, and administration, establishing a framework of governance that endured long after their departure in AD 410. Their presence introduced urban planning, engineering, and literacy, laying foundations upon which later generations would build. After Rome's withdrawal, Britain entered the shadowed era of the sub-Roman period, AD 410 to 450, marked by the collapse of centralized administration and the rise of local warlords. Amid this uncertainty, native Britons struggled to maintain identity and survival while facing incursions from Picts, Scots, and Saxons. The invitation of Germanic mercenaries, initially intended for defense, set the stage for the permanent settlement of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. By AD 450, these new arrivals had begun transforming the cultural, linguistic, and political landscape of the island, establishing the foundations of what would become Anglo-Saxon England. Over the next 2 centuries, the Heptarchy, the 7 kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, competed for dominance. Constant warfare, alliances, and migrations shaped the social and political order. Yet it was through both struggle and adaptation that a distinctive Anglo-Saxon identity emerged. Christianity, reintroduced by figures such as Saint Augustine of Canterbury in AD 597, merged with older Celtic traditions, giving rise to a unified religious and cultural framework. Monasteries became centers of learning, literacy, and record-keeping, exemplified by the monumental work of Bede in AD 731, preserving knowledge for posterity. The 8th and 9th centuries saw shifts in power as Mercia under Offa rose to prominence, while the north faced a new external threat, the Vikings. Beginning with the raid on Lindisfarne in AD 793, Norse incursions escalated into the Great Heathen Army of 865, reshaping northern and eastern England into the Danelaw. These invasions tested the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, yet leaders like Alfred the Great, r. 871 to 899, defended Wessex, instituted administrative and educational reforms, and laid the foundations for a sense of unified English identity. Alfred's successors, particularly Æthelstan, r. 924 to 939, consolidated territories, defeated the last Viking strongholds, and became the first rulers of a unified England, securing both political and cultural cohesion. Despite the emergence of a united kingdom, the 10th and early 11th centuries brought further challenges. Danish influence returned under Knut the Great, who ruled from AD 1016 to 1035, blending Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian governance, law, and culture. His reign demonstrated the kingdom's capacity to absorb foreign rule while maintaining continuity, stability, and prosperity. Subsequent rulers, including Harold Harefoot, Harthacnut, and Edward the Confessor, navigated dynastic complexities, internal noble rivalries, and the looming threat of continental intervention, reflecting the fragile yet enduring nature of the English polity. The final turning point arrived in AD 1066, when Edward's death without an heir triggered the succession crisis that would culminate in the Battle of Hastings. Harold Godwin's son, the last Anglo-Saxon king, fell defending his crown, and William, Duke of Normandy, secured victory, inaugurating the Norman Conquest. This event marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon era and the beginning of a transformed England, one that integrated centuries of Roman order, Celtic resilience, Anglo-Saxon governance, and Viking influence into a kingdom capable of evolving under new rule. By the close of this millennium-spanning journey, England had emerged as a unified realm, forged through invasions, migrations, rebellions, and consolidations. From the Roman legions to Alfred's defensive reforms, Æthelstan's unification, the Danish interlude, and the ultimate Norman conquest, The identity of the English people had been shaped by a succession of historical forces. Language, law, religion, culture, and governance were not simply inherited but continually adapted, producing a society resilient to internal and external pressures. The history of how England was formed is more than a story of conquest or kingship. It is a chronicle of transformation, adaptation, and synthesis. The kingdom that stood in AD 1066 was not the patchwork of tribal lands first encountered by the Romans, nor merely the collection of Saxon and Viking territories. It was a complex, unified entity, born of centuries of interaction, negotiation, and resilience, prepared to face the challenges of a new era under Norman rule. From the shores of Roman Britain to the heights of Norman ambition, the land and people who would call themselves English were forged through conflict, governance, culture, and adaptation. The stage was set, and England, as a unified kingdom, had emerged from over a millennium of historical evolution, ready to shape its destiny in ways that would reverberate across Europe and beyond.